These photos are pretty old.
MADiSON is a first-person psychological horror game where you play as Luca and use a camera to reveal the dark and disturbing past of your family's home. The game is available for PC, PlayStation, Xbox Series consoles, and the Nintendo Switch. Atmosphere. MADiSON's atmosphere is of deep apprehension, waiting for the inevitable and dreading the moment it arrives. From the very start of the game, there's an incredible amount of paranoia and tension as your father screams at you from the other side of a door about an event you don't remember. It's a little bewildering since things have clearly transpired before the game starts and you're joining in halfway, and it only seems to get worse after you get to your grandparents' house. The first set of jump scares really set the tone for how things will go on. A lot of the game is spent anticipating and dreading the next encounter. Reality breaks down quite quickly in the game, and the house itself almost feels alive as it keeps changing and leading to places it didn't before. And even when it presents itself as a normal house, the puzzle aspects of things are so beyond what a normal house would contain that it's bizarre. There's lots of foreboding looking areas and difficult scenarios that often build dread for yet another jump scare, and the game will drag on these moments of tension for an agonizingly long amount of time. There's an extreme level of distress in Luca's voice, and his shaky words make him seem confused, stressed, and fragile, which makes it easier to sympathize with him and the events happening to him.
So Grandpa tried to contact Grandma with this thing? Is that blood?
I almost felt bad for him as the game goes on, but there's a feeling that you aren't getting the full picture all the way through the experience. Required things like using the camera also feel like you're tempting fate, as snapping photos of objects is both a mandatory gameplay mechanic and a way to trigger events, and the constant experimentation that comes along with it feels like you'll eventually see something unsettling or trigger something you won't want to. It really feels like you're treading on eggshells through a lot of the game. MADiSON also uses sound design to create the feeling that you aren't alone by periodically putting in random bangs and scraping noises. This often gives me pause to stop in my tracks and looking around just in case anything is actually there, but as the game went on, the repeated use of this caused me to check less and less until I stopped paying attention to it, but it did create a lot of tense moments before it wore thin.
This is huge. I've never been here before.
There's also things that make noises for no reason, like the floorboards in the attic aren't moving, but they make a constant creaking noise, like they're being slowly bent. And things like this are just odd and unsettling because of how weird they are. There's a plethora of things going on that layer on top of each other to create this uneasy and nerve-wracking feeling that pervades as the game goes on. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game mostly uses jump scares and unnerving scripted events on top of the atmosphere's brilliantly executed dread to really deliver some unexpected and frankly terrifying sequences. It's often done so well that the anticipation for what you know is coming is more intolerable than the actual scare, but luckily it never feels overused. The game lures you into situations where you can sense something terrible is heading your way, and the dread really does turn into fear once that realization hits you that you have to see this through. There were a lot of areas where I wanted to leave as rapidly as possible for fear of more well-crafted jump scares. The jump scares were often effective even when you saw them coming, like its predictability proven right didn't alleviate the scare when it landed. Some sections with the enemies that never left the area, like the 1950s version of the church section, were frightening due to how the enemy randomly flickered into existence and caused unbelievable paranoia for when his next appearance would be, since he was largely invisible. However, later in the game it suddenly shifts antagonists for the final section and the game uses the same technique again whilst you try and solve puzzles, but at least for me it didn't seem to work as well here, or at least by this point in the game I was kind of used to it. The game has some of the most excellent jump scares I've ever seen that feel like you walked into them rather than they happened to you. You never know what to expect, and whether it's paranormal or not, it was always, at least for me, effective. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. The music tracks for house exploration mostly consists of low, whispery drones, with delayed and reverbed heavy synths that build up and repeated onto themselves like the sound of madness. There's a darkness to it that's almost menacing, and several of the other areas had similar sounding pieces too. When things start to escalate, it's often a new piece of music layered over the original drone with a higher pitched dissonant melody that gives off a feeling of like setting off a trap, that you've started something that can't be stopped. The incidental music that goes along with the jump scares is all brilliant and varied, from orchestral frantic swells or hits with various stringed instruments wildly flailing away, or a loud grind of some brass like a foghorn from the shores of hell. In fact, when the game goes quiet is when you know something is wrong. The encounter music is really interesting as a dissonant orchestral hit that sort of trails on for ages after the event is over, and it lingers for so long that it feels like something else is going to happen. The sound effects are pretty great and everything works well with the environments, like the tolling of the church bell is strangely eerie, and movable things like the police radio and camera worked perfectly with the very realistic reverb of the rooms, which is brilliant and adds a ton to the immersion. The voice acting is fantastic, especially for Luca and the priest on the tape. The enemy who speaks out Luca's name in dark areas was nerve-wracking every time it happened. A small complaint is that you can tell when Luca is about to say something because of the quite quiet hiss that was probably part of the recording. It's a small thing and doesn't affect the game, but it is a little weird since everything else is so good. The directional audio is a key part of a few sections of the game and also executed really well. The game is a real treat for headphone users and utilizes sound design wherever it can, and does it well. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. MADiSON has very little gore, but when blood appears, it's stunning. It looks realistic and morbid when the time arises. It's not overused or inappropriate, and the scenes that involve it are pretty impactful. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. When the game begins, it already feels like you're behind with what's happening, with a banging on the door and a voice coming from behind it yelling at you that you've done something unspeakable and ruined the family. The game alludes to a lot of things, but at least from my experience it didn't explain what this was referring to, though it does leave a lot of options for theories. I found parts of the story a little hard to understand or at least piece together from the instances where scraps of the story are fed to you, but on the other hand, there were a lot of specific character fates that were made very clear from both diary entries and tape recorders. Luca himself sometimes chimes in to explain things too. The story, from what I understood, was about demonic possession and how it affects, changes people, and ruins lives. Though I found that I didn't really understand why certain things happened or what caused them by the time the game was over, but after looking up the story it does make things clearer over why and allows for interpretations of specific events and why they took place. Even not understanding the story whilst playing, it was still pretty engaging for the parts that I understood, and it may have just been a simple case of me misunderstanding things or missing key items, making the final score 5 out of 5 Harry Masons. MADiSON is a very frightening game that executes its special blend of apprehension and dread really well. I haven't had an experience this intense in quite a while. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion on horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I never regained control of Luca, I did not go out without a fight, and advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace.